Good morning, 5A and 5B. Right, carrying on with the next chapter of Howl's Moving Castle, which is chapter 16. You might remember in the last chapter that Howl was just heading out disguised as a dog for the funeral of Mrs. Penstemon, his magic teacher. So this is chapter 16, in which there is a great deal of witchcraft. Several hours passed. The dog man was hungry again. "Why can't you have bread and cheese for once?" Calcifer grumbled. So Sophie approached with the frying pan. All the same, he bent his head. Sophie was just putting the pan on top of the curly green flames when Howl's voice rang out hoarsely from nowhere. "Brace yourself, Calcifer! She's found me!" Calcifer sprang upright. The frying pan fell across Sophie's knees. "You'll have to wait," Calcifer roared, flaming blindingly up the chimney. Almost at once he blurred into a dozen or so burning blue faces, as if he was being shaken violently about, and burned with a loud, throaty whirring. "That must mean they're fighting," Michael whispered. Sophie sucked a slightly burned finger and picked slices of bacon off her skirt with the other hand, staring at Calcifer. He was whipping from one side of the fireplace, from side to side of the fireplace. His blurred eyes pulsed from deep blue to sky blue, then to almost white. One moment he had multiple orange eyes, and the next rows of starry silver ones. She'd never imagined anything like it. Something swept overhead, with a blast and a boom which shook everything in the room. A second followed with a loud, shrill roar. Calcifer pulsed nearly blue-black, and Sophie's skin fizzed with the backblast from the magic. Michael scrambled for the window. "They're quite near." Sophie hobbled to the window too. The storm of magic seemed to have affected half the things in the room. The skull was yattering its jaw so hard it was travelling round in circles. Packets were jumping, powder was seething in jars. A book dropped heavily out of the shelves and lay open on the floor, fanning its pages back and forth. At one end of the room, the scented steam boiled out of the bathroom. At the other, Howl's guitar made out-of-tune twangings, and Calcifer whipped around harder than ever. Michael put the skull in the sink to stop it yattering itself onto the floor, while he opened the window and craned out. Whatever was happening was maddeningly just out of sight. People in the houses opposite were at doors and windows, pointing to something more or less overhead. Sophie and Michael ran to the broom cupboard, where they seized a velvet cloak each and flung them on. Sophie got the one that turned its wearer into a red-bearded man. Now she knew why Calcifer had laughed at her in the other one. Michael was a horse. But there was no time to laugh just then. Sophie dragged the door open and sped into the street, followed by the dogman, who seemed surprisingly calm about the whole thing. Michael trotted out after her with a clatter of non-existent hooves, leaving Calcifer whipping from blue to white behind them. The street was full of people looking upwards. No one had time to notice things like horses coming out of houses. Sophie looked too and found a huge cloud boiling and twisting just above the chimney tops. It was black and rotating on itself violently. White flashes that were not quite like light stabbed through the murk of it. But almost as soon as Michael and Sophie arrived, the clot of magic took on the shape of a misty bundle of fighting snakes. Then it tore in two with a noise like an enormous cat fight. One part sped yowling across the roofs and out to sea, and the second went screaming after it. Some people retreated indoors then. Sophie and Michael joined the rush of braver people down the sloping lanes to the dockside. There everyone seemed to think the best view was to be had along the curve of the harbour wall. Sophie hobbled to get out along it too, but there was no need to go beyond the shelter of the harbour master's hut. Two clouds were hanging in the air, some way out to sea. On the other side of the harbour wall, the only two clouds in the calm blue sky, it was quite easy to see them. It was equally easy to see the dark patch of storm raging on the sea between the clouds, flinging up great white-top waves. There was an unfortunate ship caught in the storm. Its masts were beating back and forth. They could see spouts of water hitting it on all sides. The crew were desperately trying to take in the sails, but at least one had been torn to flying grey rags. "Can't they have a care for that ship?" someone said indignantly. Then the wind and the waves from the storm hit the harbour wall. White water lashed over the brave persons out on the wall and came crowding hurriedly back to the quayside, where the moored ships were heaving and grinding in their moorings. Among all this was a great deal of screaming in high, singing voices. Sophie put her face out into the wind beyond the hut where the screaming came from, and discovered the raging magic had disturbed more than the sea and the wretched ship. A number of wet, slithery-looking ladies with flying green-brown hair were dragging themselves up onto the harbour wall, screaming and holding long wet arms out to more screaming ladies tossing in the waves. Every one of them had a fishtail instead of legs. "Confound it," said Sophie, "the mermaids from the curse." That meant only two more impossible things to come true now. She looked up at the two clouds. Howl was kneeling on the left-hand one, much larger and nearer than she would have expected. He was still dressed in black. Typically enough, he was staring over his shoulder at the frantic mermaids. He was not looking at them, as if you remembered they were part of the curse at all. "Keep your mind on the witch," the horse beside Sophie yelled. The witch sprang into being, standing on the right-hand cloud in a whirl of flame-coloured robe and streaming red hair, with her arms raised to invoke further magic. As Howl turned and looked at her, her arms came down. Howl's cloud erupted into a fountain of rose-coloured flame. Heat from it swept across the harbour, and the stones of the wall steamed. "It's all right," gasped the horse. Howl was on the tossing, nearly sinking ship now. He was a tiny black figure, leaning against the bucking mainmast. He let the witch know she'd missed by waving at her cheekily. The witch saw him the instant he waved. Cloud, witch, and all at once became a savagely swooping red bird diving at the ship. The ship vanished. The mermaid sang a doleful scream. There was nothing but sulkily tossing water where the ship had been. But the huge diving bird was going too fast to stop. It plunged into the sea with a huge splash. Everyone on the quayside cheered. "I knew that wasn't a real ship, really," someone behind Sophie said. "Yes, it must have been an illusion," the horse said wisely. "It was too small." As proof that the ship had been much nearer than it looked, the waves from the splash reached the harbour wall before Michael had stopped speaking. A 20-foot green hill of water rode smoothly sideways across it, sweeping the screaming mermaids into the harbour, rolling every moored ship violently sideways and thudding in swirls around the harbour master's hut. An arm came out of the side of the horse and hauled Sophie back towards the quay. Sophie gasped and stumbled in knee-high grey water. The dogman bounded beside them, soaked to the ears. They just reached the quay, and the boats in the harbour had all just rolled upright when a second mountain of water rolled over the harbour wall. Out of its smooth side burst a monster. It was a long, black-clawed thing, half cat, half sea lion, and it came racing down the wall towards the quay. Another burst out of the wave as it smashed into the harbour, long and low too, but scalier, and came racing after the first monster. Everyone realised the fight was not over yet, and splashed backwards hurriedly against the sheds and houses on the quayside. Sophie fell over a rope, then a doorstep. The arm came out of the horse and dragged her upright as the two monsters streaked past in a scatter of salt water. Another wave swirled over the harbour wall, and two more monsters burst out of that. They were identical to the first two, except the scaly one was closer to the cat-like one, and the next rolling wave brought two more closer together yet. "What's going on?" Sophie squeaked as this third pair raced past, shaking the stones of the jetty as they ran. "Illusions," Michael's voice came out of the horse. "Some of them. They're both trying to fool one another into chasing the wrong one." Who's who? Said Sophie. No idea, said the horse. Some of the onlookers found the monsters too terrifying. Many went home. Others jumped down into the rolling ships to fend them off the quay. Sophie and Michael joined the hardcore of watchers who set off through the streets of Port Haven after the monsters. First they followed a river of salt water, then huge wet paw prints, and finally white gouges and scratches where the claws of the creatures had dug into the stones of the street. These led everyone out to the back of the town, to the marshes where Sophie and Michael had chased the shooting star. By this time, all 6 creatures were bounding black dots, vanishing into the flat distance. The crowd spread out into a ragged line on the bank, staring, hoping for more, and afraid of what they might see. After a while, no one could see anything but empty marsh. Nothing happened. Quite a few people were turning away to leave, when of course everyone else shouted, "Look!" And a ball of pale fire rolled lazily up in the distance. It must have been enormous. The bang that went with it only hit the watchers when the fireball had become a tower of spreading smoke. The line of all people all winced at the blunt thunder of it. They watched the smoke spread until it became part of the mist on the marches. They went on watching after that, but there was simply peace and silence. The wind rattled the marsh weeds and birds began to dare to cry again. "I reckon they must have done for one another," people said. The crowd gradually split into separate figures, hurrying away to jobs they left half done. Sophie and Michael waited until the very last, when it was clear that it was indeed all over. Then they turned slowly back into Port Haven. Neither of them felt like speaking. Only the dog man seemed happy. He sauntered beside them so friskily, Sophie was sure he thought Howl was done for. He was so pleased with life that when they turned into the street where Howl's house was, and there happened to be a stray cat crossing the road, the dog man uttered a joyful bark and galloped after it. He chased it with a dash and a skitter straight to the castle doorstep, where it turned and glared. "Get off!" it mewed. "This is all I need." The dog backed away, looking ashamed. Michael clattered up to the door. "Howl!" he shouted. The cat shrank to kitten size and looked very sorry for itself. "And you both look ridiculous," it said. "Open the door. I'm exhausted." Sophie opened the door and the cat crawled inside. The cat crawled to the hearth where Calcifer was down to the merest blue flicker, and with an effort got its paws up onto the chair seat. There it grew rather slowly into Howl, bent double. "Did you kill the witch?" Michael asked eagerly, taking off his cloak and becoming himself too. "No," said Howl. He turned round and flopped into the chair, where he lay, looking very tired indeed. "Ugh, all that on top of a cold," he croaked. "Sophie, for pity's sake, take off that horrible red beard and find the bottle of brandy in the closet, unless you've drunk it or turned it into turpentine, of course." Sophie took off her cloak and found the brandy in a glass. Howl drank one glass off as if it was water. Then he poured out a second glass and instead of drinking it, dripped it carefully on Calcifer. Calcifer flared and sizzled and seemed to revive a little. Howl poured a third glass and lay back sipping it. "Don't stand staring at me," he said. "I don't know who won. That witch is mighty hard to come at. She relies mostly on her fire demon and stays behind out of trouble. But I think we gave her something to think about, eh, Calcifer?" "It's old," Calcifer said in a weak fizzle from under his logs. "I'm stronger, but it knows things I never thought of. She's had it 100 years and it's half killed me." He fizzled a bit and then climbed further out of his logs to grumble. "You might have warned me." "I did, you old fraud," Howl said wearily. "You know everything I know." Howl lay sipping brandy while Michael found bread and sausage for them to eat. Food revived them all, except perhaps the dog man, who seemed subdued now. Howl was back after all. Calcifer began to burn and look his usual blue self. This won't do, Howl said. He hauled himself to his feet. Look sharp, Michael. The witch knows we're in Port Haven. We're not only going to have to move the castle and the Kingsbury entrance now. I shall have to transfer Calcifer to the house that goes with the hat shop. Move me? Calcifer crackled. He was azure with apprehension. That's right, said Howl. You have a choice between market chipping or the witch. Don't go and be difficult. Curses, wailed Calcifer, and dived to the bottom of the grate. Whew, that was exciting. Okay, next time, chapter 17, in which the moving castle moves house. Okay, more next time.